What if the world's debt crisis isn't a bug in the system, but the system itself? Every year, governments promise fiscal discipline. Every election cycle, politicians talk about reducing deficits. Yet somehow, debt keeps rising, not just in America, but across nearly every major economy on Earth. Today, global debt has reached levels that would have been considered impossible just a generation ago. And now, as governments pour trillions into electric vehicles, battery factories, charging infrastructure, green energy projects, and industrial subsidies, a disturbing question emerges. What if the future we're building can only exist because of debt? What if the electric revolution that promises to save the planet is also accelerating the biggest financial trap in modern history? Because once you understand how debt, technology, and government spending are connected, you'll realize why nations may never be able to stop borrowing again. Imagine a family that spends more money every year than it earns. Eventually, that family would go bankrupt. Yet governments operate differently. When they run out of money, they borrow more. When old debts come due, they issue new debt. When economic growth slows, they borrow even faster. For decades, this system seemed manageable because debt helped finance roads, infrastructure, schools, military spending, and economic development. But then, something changed. Modern economies became dependent on continuous growth. Politicians discovered that voters loved spending programs but hated spending cuts. Businesses became dependent on cheap financing. Financial markets became addicted to low interest rates. Soon, borrowing stopped being a temporary solution and became a permanent feature of the system. Today, many governments spend enormous portions of their budgets simply paying interest on existing debt. Yet despite these rising costs, borrowing continues because stopping would create economic pain. Infrastructure projects would stall, government programs would shrink, growth would slow, unemployment could rise. The result is a cycle where every problem is solved with more borrowing. And now, a new challenge is demanding trillions of dollars in additional investment: the transition to electric transportation. Governments around the world are subsidizing electric vehicles, battery manufacturing, rare earth mining, charging stations, and renewable energy infrastructure. Supporters call it investment in the future. Critics call it another debt-funded expansion. But regardless of perspective, one reality remains. The electric revolution is arriving at the exact moment governments can least afford it. The shift from gasoline to electricity sounds simple. Replace gas stations with chargers. Replace engines with batteries. Replace oil consumption with clean energy. But beneath those headlines lies one of the most expensive industrial transformations ever attempted. Building an electric future requires massive investment. New battery factories cost billions. Charging networks require enormous infrastructure spending. Power grids need upgrades. Mining operations must expand to secure lithium, nickel, cobalt, and rare earth materials. Governments aren't merely encouraging this transition, they're helping finance it through subsidies, tax credits, grants, and industrial policies. In the United States alone, hundreds of billions of dollars have been directed toward clean energy and manufacturing initiatives. Similar efforts are happening across Europe and Asia. The goal is understandable. Countries want technological leadership, energy security, and lower emissions. But funding such ambitions often requires additional borrowing. And here's the uncomfortable reality. Debt creates future obligations. Every dollar borrowed today must eventually be repaid, refinanced, or inflated away. The more governments invest using debt, the more dependent they become on future economic growth. If growth fails to meet expectations, debt burdens become heavier. Suddenly, the success of entire fiscal strategies depends on assumptions about technology adoption, consumer demand, and global competitiveness. The electric vehicle revolution may transform transportation, but it is also becoming one of the largest financial bets governments have ever placed. Most people think government debt is an abstract problem affecting future generations. But debt often reaches households in unexpected ways. When governments borrow heavily, they compete for capital. When central banks intervene, money supply dynamics change. When deficits expand, inflation risks can rise. The relationship is complex, but the consequences are real. Consider the electric vehicle transition. Governments subsidize production. Manufacturers receive incentives. Consumers receive tax credits. Infrastructure projects receive funding. These programs help accelerate adoption, but they also increase public spending. In some cases, the immediate benefits are visible, while the long-term costs remain hidden. Higher debt may contribute to future tax burdens. Inflation can reduce purchasing power. Interest payments consume growing portions of government budgets. The irony is that technologies designed to create a more efficient future often require enormous inefficiencies in the present. The public sees new factories, charging stations, and electric cars. What remains largely invisible are the financing mechanisms supporting them. Financial markets understand this dynamic well. Investors constantly evaluate whether economic growth can outpace debt growth. If debt rises faster than productivity, warning signs begin to appear. And that's why the electric vehicle revolution isn't merely a technology story. It's a debt story, an inflation story, and ultimately, a story about who pays for progress. Here's the paradox at the center of the modern economy. Governments need growth to manage debt, but achieving growth increasingly requires spending, and spending increasingly requires borrowing. This creates a cycle that becomes difficult to escape. If governments cut spending dramatically, economic growth may slow. If growth slows, tax revenues decline. If revenues decline, deficits grow. To avoid that outcome, policymakers often choose additional borrowing. The electric vehicle transition perfectly illustrates this dilemma. Leaders believe technological investment will generate future growth, jobs, innovation, and competitiveness. To capture those benefits, they spend now and worry about repayment later. The strategy can work if economic growth exceeds borrowing costs. But if growth disappoints, debt accumulates faster than expected. This is why many economists describe debt as manageable until suddenly it isn't. For years, debt appears sustainable. Then interest costs rise. Markets become nervous. Governments face difficult choices. The challenge isn't simply reducing debt. It's maintaining a system built around debt-dependent growth. That's why nations rarely stop borrowing. They can't. The entire structure of modern finance, government spending, and economic expansion has evolved around the assumption that tomorrow will be larger than today. And as long as that assumption remains intact, borrowing continues. The real question isn't whether debt will grow. The real question is what happens when growth can no longer keep up. But the greatest threat may not come from debt itself. It may come from the solution governments choose when debt becomes too large to manage. Throughout history, nations facing overwhelming debt have often turned to the same escape route, creating more money. And when money becomes easier to create than wealth, something far more dangerous begins to emerge. The value of savings starts to erode. Asset prices explode. Inequality widens. Entire generations discover that working harder no longer guarantees financial security. And that raises an even darker question. What if the next crisis isn't a debt crisis at all, but a currency crisis? Next episode, the silent theft, how inflation makes you poor without you noticing. What if nobody needs to steal your money, because inflation can do it legally?